Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Tonight, I would like to deal with an issue, a follow-up on yesterday's submission. Specifically, why is CCC, Nelson Chamisa and Company, hell-bent on participating in the 2023 elections and will never boycott the elections, no matter what? Well, this issue is important because behind it explains why ZANU-PF has arrogantly and blatantly disregarded all calls for democratic reforms to ensure elections are free, fair, and credible. ZANU-PF is confident that no matter what, CCC will participate in these elections, and as long as they participate, the regime will have legitimacy. To understand this, we've got to go back to the GNU. In 2008, the election process, starting with the March one, was such that ZANU-PF was losing the March 2008 elections. And before the elections themselves, SADC had put ZANU-PF under enormous pressure to carry out fundamental election changes that allowed the process to be probably the most free, fair, and credible election that Zimbabwe had had up to that time. And when the results, the March vote happened, March 2008 vote happened, and the results, ZANU-PF through its networks learned that the party was losing big time. ZANU-PF sport rigging machinery was switched back on. They told ZEC to stop declaring the results. And they went on to take over the whole process, and in the next 6 months carried out a new vote count. They were only counting 5 million votes, but it took them 6 months. The reason for it then, of course, became clear. Apparently, Morgan Tsvangirai in that election had won a staggering 73% of the votes. And they needed to water it down. And that is what it took time. And they watered it down to 47%. And enough to deny Morgan Tsvangirai the clear 50% plus one majority, and thus force a runoff. And then during the runoff, they used wanton violence to punish Zimbabweans for having rejected ZANU-PF in the first place, and make sure that they vote for Mugabe during the runoff. Morgan Tsvangirai was forced to withdraw because the wanton violence was such that he could not hold any meaningful rallies at all. SADC and the AU could not ignore what had happened. And so for the first time, they refused to endorse the election results. ZANU-PF's claim, or rather Mugabe's claim, that he had won the elections. And they forced ZANU-PF to go into the GNU. And it was the GNU itself that determined why, at the end of it, MDC, now CCC, could not boycott elections from their own. Up to that time, they could have boycotted elections, but from their own, they could not. What happened during the GNU is that MDC had the golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms, and they failed to implement any meaningful reforms, not even one. Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends were bribed by Mugabe with all the trappings of high office, and they've completely forgot about the reforms. Indeed, during that time when people asked ZANU-PF why was MDC not implementing reforms, the ZANU-PF cronies boasted of how mazivano MDC adzidza kusvika Nyerere. In other words, MDC leaders have learned to enjoy the gravy train, the trappings of the gravy train. They'll never rock the boat. They'll never implement the reforms. And that's exactly what happened. People should understand that. When you understand that, you finally realize what a tragedy that was. Because at the end of the 5 years GNU, with not even one meaningful democratic reform implemented, SADC leaders realized going into the 2013 elections without any reforms was just futile. And they actually called a special SADC summit in Maputo, Mozambique, in which they made their position very clear as SADC, as a regional body. They didn't want the 2013 elections to go ahead without reforms. And they told Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends in their faces that if you go into these elections, you will lose. You've got to have democratic reforms to stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections. What ZANU-PF initially, Robert Mugabe and his ZANU-PF friends initially accepted that reality. And remember, during the GNU, SADC was the guarantor of the GNU. And so SADC had a say in the elections. And they could have turned around and said those elections were fraud. And this comes back to the 2 points that one can split why MDC guys did not listen to SADC's warning and participated in those elections. The number one was greed. This was actually admitted by David Coulthard in his book. And I mentioned it yesterday, and I'll mention it again here. In his book, The Struggle Continues, 50 Years of Tyranny in Zimbabwe, David Coulthard admitted that they participated in the 20, i.e. him and his friends in the MDC, participated in the MDC in the 2013 elections because, as he says, and I read, the worst aspect for me about the failure to agree on a coalition was that both MDCs couldn't now do the obvious, withdraw from the elections. The electoral process was so flawed, so illegal, that the only logical step was to withdraw, which would have compelled SADC to hold ZANU-PF to account. But such was the distrust between MDC-T and MDC-N that neither would withdraw for fear the other would remain in the election, winning seats and giving the process credibility. So it was their own greed within the opposition that kept them in the election in 2013. But that was not the only thing. I dealt with the issue of greed yesterday. Today, I would like to deal with another reason why they could not withdraw. The truth is, when when SADC demanded that the election should be postponed, ZANU-PF initially agreed that they should be postponed. But later on, changed their mind. And when they got back to Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF leaders called a press conference. And in the press conference, they invited SADC leaders, diplomatic mission representatives, SADC diplomatic representatives in Zimbabwe and other diplomats and the press. And at that meeting, ZANU-PF said they could not postpone the election as requested by SADC to give time for reforms because there were no outstanding reforms to be implemented. In other words, and the person who gave that press conference was Patrick Chinamasa. He was then, during the GNU, the Minister of Justice and Parliamentary Affairs. And he had the authority, he could say with confidence, there are no outstanding democratic reforms for Parliament to implement. Because they'd not even one reform proposal had been submitted. And he said that as the challenge. Why would we postpone the elections when there are no outstanding reforms to be implemented? And I challenge you to tell me of one reform that we have failed to implement. And of course, when SADC learned that, they also realized that was the end of the story. They could not push for elections to be postponed on the basis of implementing reforms when there had not been any. In fact, it's not a question of there were no outstanding reforms. There were no reforms that had been implemented. No reform proposal had been implemented. MDC at the time could not boycott the 2013 elections. Boycott them on what basis? They could not boycott elections on the basis, oh, we want reforms to be implemented. When people turn around and say, wait a minute, you were in the GNU for 5 years. You failed to submit even one reform proposal. So who are you boycotting, in protesting against here? You were the one with the opportunity to implement the reforms. You had the opportunity to submit reform proposals. You did not. In 5 years, you failed to submit even one reform proposal. So you are boycotting in protest at your own incompetence. So they had no choice but to participate in those elections. And the same applies in 2018. They were protesting that ZANU-PF should implement reforms. ZANU-PF did not implement any meaningful reforms because they could turn around and say, well, you had the chance to implement reforms. Why didn't you implement them during the GNU? And of course, once ZANU-PF had won the elections in majority in parliament in 2013, they had now the responsibility to implement any reforms, make any reform proposals and implement them. And as a majority in parliament, they didn't have the obligation, any pressure to implement reforms. And MDC participated in those elections, pretending now that they could still win the elections because they would have, as Chamisa put it, they had stringent measures to stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections. This has been the theme for MDC ever since the GNU. MDC, now CCC, cannot boycott elections because they are the ones who failed to implement reforms when they had the opportunity to do so. And it's their fault that no meaningful reforms were implemented during the GNU. And therefore, then they could not blame ZANU-PF for not implementing reforms when they are the ones who are responsible for it. And therefore, for MDC to talk of boycotting elections in 2023 is a non-starter, just as it was a non-starter in 2013. And as long as ZANU-PF knows that MDC or CCC will participate in these elections, there is no pressure on ZANU-PF to implement reforms. And ZANU-PF will never reform itself out of power. That is a simple political reality. And so we are caught up with this situation where we have got the main opposition, MDC/CCC, which has got to keep on participating in an election process that is so flawed that by their own admission, by David Coulthard's own admission, the only logical thing, the obvious thing to do is to boycott. And yet they cannot boycott because they themselves have lost the innocence of boycotting elections on the basis of pushing for reforms. Because when they had the opportunity to implement the reforms, they failed to implement the reforms. That is the reality we are dealing with here. In today's one of Zimbabwe's dailies today, they had a cartoon of Nelson Chamisa in the boxing ring with Mnangagwa. And I think in many ways, this cartoon depicts the reality in Zimbabwe. In the cartoon, Nelson Chamisa is depicted entering the ring, but so helpless that he's tied up, he cannot fight back. And ZANU-PF and their supporters are cheering Mnangagwa, walking into the ring, threatening with his jabs and so forth. And Chamisa will have to take the punishment. This, in many ways, depicts the reality in Zimbabwe. We have a situation now where the opposition is totally helpless because of greed, one, and two, because when they had the opportunity to implement the reforms, they could not. And so now they cannot boycott the elections. They've got to participate. And they are totally helpless. I think the people of Zimbabwe have got to wake up to the reality that ever since the 2008 to 2013 GNU, the opposition, the country's main opposition, have put themselves in such a helpless position that it really is meaningless to expect them to do anything. They cannot implement the reforms, nor can they boycott the elections to force reforms to be implemented. So all they can do is participate. And when they participate, they give legitimacy to the regime. And the question now is, how long are we going to allow this madness to continue? The opposition in Zimbabwe has been totally discredited because of their own incompetence and because of their own greed. And the nation cannot be expected to keep on paying for their incompetence. SADC granted ZANU-PF legitimacy in 2013 when they realized that no meaningful reforms had been implemented by MDC during the GNU. And it was pointless for them to pressure ZANU-PF to implement reforms when there are no outstanding reforms to be implemented. And SADC did the same thing again in 2018. But I think SADC, if they want to be honest, have got to accept it, that by punishing the MDC, they are punishing the whole of Zimbabwe, ordinary Zimbabweans. And I think it is grossly unfair, to say the least, that the people of Zimbabwe should continue to be punished for the sins or the inadequacies of the opposition. And in this particular case, it should also be emphasized the consequences of Zimbabwe's economic and political collapse is being felt outside Zimbabwe's borders, notably South Africa, Botswana, and Zambia. And I think it is important that these SADC countries wake up to that reality and accept the present situation is untenable. You cannot punish the whole region just because MDC or CCC are corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless. MDC cannot boycott these elections, even if they wanted to, because they've lost the innocence to do so. They also are participating, of course, because of greed. ZANU-PF is clever enough to make sure that they keep on participating by making sure they are giving away a few seats to entice them to participate. And last November, in fact, Mnangagwa increased the bait for their participation by giving away US $40,000 for a housing loan, which even Chamisa himself could not deny was a bribe. That way he guarantees that the opposition keep on participating. They cannot boycott. And so we end up with this untenable situation where we've got an opposition that is totally helpless, has no chance of winning rigged elections, but keep on pretending they can win them when they know that they cannot. And they know they cannot boycott the elections because they will be protesting against their own incompetence, which ZANU-PF has already shown that they were incompetent and is exploiting to its advantage. But SADC, we are asking SADC to stop punishing the rest of Zimbabwe because of the incompetence of the opposition. That is the argument. Thank you and good night.